COM 331 is a final year capstone subject. It's interdisciplinary in nature, so all students have to complete this subject, which means that it sits in a very important position throughout their learning journey, in that it brings together everything they've learnt throughout their program so far, and in that regard assures that they have achieved certain learning outcomes prior to leaving UOW and entering the workforce. Throughout that time, we've seen many changes in content, in teaching methods, in assessment, in rubric development and rubric assurance, and in marking guidelines and criteria, as we've begun to constantly enforce continuous improvement in our subject and our teaching team. Because it's interdisciplinary in nature, initially just deciding on the content that we would deliver in this subject, it required a lot of a thought, and then how we would assure the student learning outcomes of problem solving and critical thinking, technology skills, oral and written communication skills, what assessments we would put around those, and how we would assure that our students had those skills before they moved into industry. And so that requires continuous improvement, and as different cohorts of students come in. And so we've changed a number of our practices throughout the last few years. So summarising at the beginning of tutorials, moving from more quizzes to more group-based activities, more critical thinking type activities in the classroom. So very much activity-based, fun activities for our students as they come together in their multidisciplinary teams. The students then move to the laboratories where they play a computer simulation, and that simulation is there to help scaffold their learning of what a real work-based environment might look like prior to them entering industry. And whilst this computer lab has actually stayed the same over the last few years, the different resources that we've developed to help in the laboratories and help role play this environment that they're in. So we created videos for the students to watch, newsletters for the students to read prior to entering the laboratories. So different resources, learning guides that we've developed to enable them to become more familiar with this environment that they're learning in, to enable to help them to do their assessment work that's built around that. The use of rubrics have changed a lot throughout the last few years in the capstone. Initially, whilst we focused on content and assessments, the marking guides, whilst they seemed sufficient at the time, once they became more developed over time, it became quite obvious that a more detailed rubric enabled the students to understand what we expect of them more, and also in order for us to help them in their learning outcomes when they come back to us in order to provide them with feedback. The rubrics have also allowed us to reduce our marking time in some regards, in that whilst they take longer to mark in that instant, the students are no longer coming back to you with queries or as many questions as they were previously. So that saves time in the long run. So the rubrics overall have greatly changed, and we've introduced them quite slowly. We always start with a change in one campus before moving to one of our offshore campuses, just to enable some of those initial experiences and feedback to be taken into account. And a rubric is something that's not stagnant. It's important that as a teaching team we talk about what's happening with the rubric, what feedback are we getting from the students, what feedback are we getting from the tutors, and those changes then incorporated into the rubric to tell a story, I guess, of our journey as we're learning as much as the students are in some regards. The Assurance of Learning cycle, because the capstone sits at the end of the Faculty of Business programs, undergraduate programs, it very much assures the students' learning. So therefore, we have undertaken to do the Assurance of Learning process every session. We chose to do this as a team because the rubrics were developed intricately with the subject and with our assurance of learning criteria. So whilst we modified our rubrics there and our systems to incorporate the assurance of learning processes, it was easiest for us to gather this data each session. And I find that gathering at each session and for all students enables us to get a really holistic perspective of the learning outcomes that our students have at the end of the day before they leave us, and where any gaps are and where we can improve. And that then will enable us to go back and possibly change some of our content delivery or teaching methods or assessment. Starting the assurance of learning process, we initially started with an Excel spreadsheet-based type system as we were working out as a team what criteria, how we would include that criteria into our assessment, how that was best presented to the students so that they could understand it when they were completing their work. And whilst this Excel spreadsheet seemed quite cumbersome in nature, the tutors were trained and the students were presented with a rubric which enabled us to fill it in electronically. Where we are moving to now is a Moodle online gradebook system where the assessment can be opened online and the tutor can be marking the students' work online in the same rubric that we had in the Excel spreadsheet. So over time, trying to reduce marking time for tutors and increase the visibility of what we require for students. I think the assurance of learning process gives us a holistic perspective of where our students sit in terms of our learning outcomes. Having now done the assurance of learning process for a number of sessions, initially we could see that the students didn't have enough skills in critical thinking in their essay writing. We could see that we weren't necessarily measuring the teamwork capability well enough. So it enabled us to go back and look at our program as a whole and possibly go back to the course director and look at the first year experience. Where was our students receiving this type of skill that they needed before they get to their final year in their capstone subject? So we've seen over time that as we've done that each session, the writing ability of our students has increased, their report writing skills, their critical thinking. They know a lot of the concepts now before entering our subject than they did previously a couple of years ago. So I'm finding that we are able to, as a teaching team, look at providing more challenging opportunities for our students now that there's a certain baseline there, and hopefully that continuous feedback will continue as we move forward. Throughout COM 331 in all our teaching methods and practices and assessments, all our interventions and teaching methods and practices and feedback have been incorporated in order to close the loop so that our student learning outcomes are achieved.
When they enter the computer lab for the first time and work on the IDLE simulation, they don't understand initially what is required of them, particularly with having to run a simulation company. They've never been exposed to running a company in reality or in a simulation. And I find that over the course of the 4 weeks that they do the simulation, by providing them with more tailored learning and application of the UN Global Principles, I found that when I explain the principles to them, particularly the environmental principles, that helps them to understand how their company has to abide by these laws and regulations to, I guess, improve the reputation for the company, improve their product quality, enhance their relationship with their customers and their suppliers. With that ongoing learning each week, by the end of the session, they are quite experienced and knowledgeable in relation to the types of laws and regulations they have to understand and consider when they have to run a company. Quite often their understanding is purely that a company has to be run for making a profit. They don't think that they have to consider their employees, their suppliers, international standards, environmental standards. By the end of the subject, they are much more developed and they become better skilled students to become employable in the future.
We scaffold the tutorials and we do mini essays in each of the tutorials to help them with that structuring of the link, because they come from all different disciplines. That you've got accountants and economists and marketing, and so their skill sets are quite different from each of the disciplines. And so now, by doing that, each tutorial we're helping them build that skill to write a high quality academic essay linking the theories to the articles. And we've seen a dramatic improvement in their writing skills and their critical thinking because of that scaffolding that we've now done in the first few weeks of session, that we changed that assessment, and it's really improved their writing. With the rubric, we make it available on the Moodle site for them to look at before they sit the test, so they know what we're looking for. And it's quite a detailed rubric. It goes into all the critical thinking, the business analysis, the communication, referencing, grammar, and so they can see what we're looking for. And I think that's important for the students to know what we're going to mark, what we want from the assessment. And the essay rubric is very detailed, and it does take time as a marker to complete it to make sure that it is accurate. But yeah, I think it does really show them what we're looking for and what is required in the assessment.
In this individual reflection, we kind of focus on students' strengths. They have to work in a team, they have to kind of manage their time, others' time, they have to manage their expectations and understand their own values, their own strengths, and in a way their own identity as well. So during that process, we kind of ask different questions, and for example, we ask, what do you think about these things? I mean, how do you approach this kind of a question? So how do you kind of like incorporate these things into your assignments? So in that process, students understand their own strengths and what kind of things they should focus in their future workplaces, I think.
So with Com331 marking rubrics, they were a lot more informative compared to previous subjects that I've done. It was more, you could go and mark your own essay, I found, and you could see where you were lacking and where you could improve upon. It was very much more in the sense of they actually guided you through the style of writing that they wanted from you. We did introduction, editing in one of our classes, and that was probably one of the more imperative things I found to be an enhancement of my skills. With our self-reflection that we were meant to do at the end of the semester, I found that that was probably one of the most difficult things that I've had to do in my time at university. Very much reflecting upon yourself and finding the flaws within your own work, but also finding the flaws within your teammates, but also the wins that you're finding in those situations and things that you have learned. It's very much something that in my current workplace, we have weekly achievement plans, and every week we have a reflection on what our wins have been and what our losses have been, and it's very much part of that critical thinking. It's also thinking of yourself in that critical aspect. It's also taking on the feedback from others. So I guess in that sense, the feedback that I have to give to my staff, the feedback that I get back from my managers, and the feedback that I had to give to myself during that assessment, it very much elevated me in that sense of thinking and learning. I think that with Com331, every step along the way, it was very much, we were brought back to reality. We were always asked to address the impact that our decisions, and even though they were assessment based, we were to reflect upon how our choices affected the companies that we were running.